My wife said your masculinity is betrayal, so I became the be soft man she demanded and let life collapse until she begged for the real me back. Imagine standing in front of your family, plate of perfectly smoked ribs in hand, only to hear your wife declare you toxic in front of everyone. My world shattered in that moment, and I knew nothing would ever be the same. The afternoon sun beat down on my parents' backyard, the air thick with the scent of charcoal and my 3-hour labor of love, those ribs. It was supposed to be a perfect family barbecue, a picture of domestic bliss, until it wasn't. My name is Michael, and for 32 years, I genuinely believed I was doing everything right as a husband. I changed the oil in both our cars without ever being asked. I'd crawl out of bed at 2 a.m. to fix the garbage disposal when it started making that infernal grinding noise. Every single heavy grocery bag I carried from the car to the kitchen because Chloe had that bad back from an old accident. I worked my tail off, 50-hour weeks as a project manager, just so she could chase her passion for graphic design without the crushing weight of being the primary breadwinner. My father, Arthur, instilled in me that being a man meant showing up, providing, protecting, and never, ever complaining about it. My mom, Eleanor, taught me that actions spoke volumes louder than words, and that true love was measured in sacrifice. I truly believed Chloe appreciated all of this. Why else would she marry me? She'd smile when I fixed things, thank me for handling the finances, and never, not once, complained about how I approached our marriage. That Saturday started like so many others at my parents' house. Dad, Arthur, was at the grill, that familiar focused intensity etched on his face. Mom, Eleanor, was setting out her legendary potato salad. And Chloe's sister, Grace, had driven all the way down from Portland with her new boyfriend, who seemed nice enough, but couldn't peel his eyes off his phone for more than a minute. The backyard air was a comforting blend of charcoal and barbecue sauce, the kind of smell that just wraps you in warmth and nostalgia. Chloe looked so relaxed, laughing at something Grace said, sipping her wine in the late afternoon glow. I remember thinking how absolutely beautiful she was in that yellow sundress, feeling this deep, quiet gratitude for the life we'd built, the life I worked so hard to maintain. Then dinner started. About 20 minutes in, right after my dad launched into his classic story about accidentally locking himself in the shed, Chloe suddenly stood up. She tapped her wine glass with her fork, that little clink people do at weddings to demand attention. The entire table went silent. My first thought was maybe she was going to announce something incredible. Was she pregnant? Had she landed some massive client for her design work? Instead, she cleared her throat. And then she said she wanted to share something important with everyone who mattered most to her. My stomach dropped like a stone, even before the words fully formed, because her voice had this unnerving, rehearsed quality. Like she'd practiced it 100 times in front of a mirror. She said, I've been doing a lot of reading lately about relationship dynamics and gender roles, and I've come to realize something really important about our marriage. The forced enthusiasm in her voice, that almost exclamation point, should have been my first real warning. She kept going, explaining she'd been reflecting on how traditional masculinity shows up in our relationship, and how much of what we consider normal is actually rooted in patriarchal structures that limit both of us. I watched my father's face go completely blank, that expression he gets when something just doesn't compute. My mom stopped chewing, her fork hovering in midair. Grace's boyfriend suddenly found a deep, intense fascination with his coleslaw. Chloe, oblivious, pressed on. Michael embodies a lot of toxic masculine traits, and I think it's time we acknowledge that so he can evolve into a more emotionally available and progressive partner. Toxic. The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. She began listing examples. He always insisted on driving on long trips, she stated, which denies my agency. He handled all our finances, she continued, which infantilized me. He fixed things around the house without asking if I wanted to learn, she claimed, robbing me of growth opportunities. And he made decisions about home security and maintenance without consulting me, she concluded, which I label as controlling behavior. Every single thing I thought made me a good husband was being systematically reframed as evidence of my deeply problematic nature. I could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath. My father's fork scraped against his plate, a tiny, furious sound in the otherwise deafening silence. Grace looked utterly mortified, staring down at the table as if willing herself to disappear. Part of me wanted to erupt. To defend myself, to shout that Chloe had never once complained about any of these things. That she'd actively encouraged me to handle the finances because she loathed dealing with budgets. That she'd thanked me just last week for fixing the leaky faucet she'd been complaining about for days. But something stopped me. And in that moment, I had what you could only call a terrifying clarity of vision. I realized arguing would be utterly pointless. Chloe hadn't arrived at this conclusion through logic or observation of our life. She'd absorbed it from somewhere else. Probably her online communities, or her new therapist, or those endless podcasts she'd been binge listening to during her morning walks. No amount of rational discussion was going to change her mind. Because this wasn't really about me. It was about her desperate need to be seen as progressive, as enlightened. So instead of defending myself, instead of getting angry or hurt, or even walking away, I did something that shocked everyone, including myself. I set down my fork, very deliberately, very carefully. I looked directly at Chloe. And I smiled. Not a fake smile, not a bitter one. A genuine, unsettling smile. "You know what?" I said, my voice calm, almost cheerful. "You're absolutely right." Confusion flickered across Chloe's face. This clearly wasn't the reaction she'd expected. I told her that I'd been operating under outdated assumptions about what marriage should look like and that I truly appreciated her brave honesty in calling me out. I said I was committed to evolving into the kind of partner she deserved. Someone who rejected traditional masculine roles and embraced true equality in every single aspect of our relationship. My dad made a noise, it might have been a cough or a strangled protest. My mom reached over and grabbed his hand, physically stopping him from saying anything. Chloe's expression shifted, from surprised to pleased, as if she'd just won an argument she didn't even know she was having. She sat back down, squeeze. Ed my hand across the table, told me she was proud of me for being so receptive, and declared this the beginning of a better chapter for us. Grace looked visibly relieved that the excruciating moment had passed. The rest of dinner continued with a forced normalcy, but I barely tasted my food. Inside my head, a plan was forming. Cold. Clear. Sharp as ice water. If Chloe wanted me to stop being traditionally masculine, if she wanted true equality without any of those protective instincts or provider behaviors she just labeled as toxic, then that's exactly what she was going to get. Not halfway. Not partially. Completely and absolutely. I was going to give her the evolved man she demanded, and I was going to do it so thoroughly, so precisely, that she'd understand exactly what she had just asked for. On the drive home, Chloe chattered excitedly about what a breakthrough moment this was for our marriage. She said she'd been worried I'd react defensively. I kept my eyes on the road, making agreeable noises, while mentally cataloging every single thing I did in our daily life that she'd just categorized as problematic. It was a longer list than I'd realized. When we got home, I told her that starting tomorrow, I was implementing immediate changes to ensure I respected her full autonomy and agency. She kissed my cheek and said she loved me, completely missing the chilling edge in my voice. That night, while she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I thought about the garbage disposal I'd fixed. The tire I'd changed in the rain last month. The spiders I'd removed from the bathroom. The bills I'd organized. The security system I'd installed. The gutters I'd cleaned. The flat tire I'd changed on her car last winter, at midnight. Every single act of service that I thought demonstrated love was, apparently, just evidence of my toxic need to control and protect. Fine, I thought. Let's see how long love survives without any of that foundation. She didn't know it yet, but Chloe had just dismantled our entire marriage with one public speech. And tomorrow morning, I was going to stand back and let her watch it collapse. The evolution began the very next morning, at 6:30 a.m., when my alarm went off. I did something I had never, not once, done in 7 years of marriage. I got up, made myself a single cup of coffee in my travel mug, grabbed my keys, and headed out the door for work. Without making Chloe's usual cappuccino. It sounds petty, I know, when I say it out loud. But that cappuccino had been part of our morning ritual since we moved in together. Something I did automatically while she showered, timed perfectly, so it was still hot when she came downstairs. That morning, she came down in her bathrobe, expecting to find it waiting on the counter, and instead found nothing. I was already gone. She texted me around 8 a.m., asking if everything was okay. I replied that everything was great. I was just respecting her autonomy by not assuming she needed me to make her coffee, like she couldn't handle basic tasks herself. She sent back a confused emoji but didn't push it. That was Monday. By Wednesday, the small changes had started to pile up in ways that created friction neither of us acknowledged directly. Our garbage disposal had been making a weird rattling noise for 2 days, the kind of sound that meant something was stuck in the blades, probably a piece of silverware. Normally, I would have already fixed it. But when Chloe mentioned it, I told her I had complete faith in her ability to troubleshoot mechanical issues and that I didn't want to rob her of the learning opportunity. She stared at me for a long moment, then said she'd look up a YouTube tutorial. 3 days later, the disposal was still rattling because she never got around to watching the video. The dog food situation became an issue on Thursday. We have a 70-pound German Shepherd named Duke who goes through a 40-pound bag of kibble every 3 weeks. I always kept the bag in the garage and filled his bowl twice a day, because lifting that massive bag required some muscle, and Chloe had that bad back. Thursday evening, she went to feed Duke and found his container empty. The new bag was sitting in the trunk of my car, where I'd left it after the pet store. She asked me to bring it in. I explained, very pleasantly, that I was working on not automatically assuming physical tasks were my responsibility, that carrying heavy objects was something any capable adult could manage with proper lifting technique, and that I believed in her strength. Chloe's face did this thing where her jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything. She tried to lift the bag herself, struggled for a solid minute, then ended up dragging it across the garage floor and leaving it there. Duke ate half portions for 2 days until I finally brought it inside. Not because she asked, but because I felt bad for the dog. The washing machine incident happened the following week, and this is where things started to shift from merely annoying to actually problematic. Our washer is one of those high-efficiency front loaders that occasionally gets mold buildup if you don't clean the rubber seal, and it had started to smell like mildew. Chloe asked if I could take a look. I reminded her that household maintenance was a shared responsibility and that I trusted her judgment on how to handle it. She got frustrated, saying she didn't know anything about washing machine maintenance. I suggested she could Google it or call a repair person, stressing that I was trying not to be the kind of husband who treated her like she was incapable of problem solving. The machine kept smelling worse, and our clothes started coming out with this sour odor that meant we had to rewash everything. She eventually called a repair guy who charged us $200 to do what I could have done in 15 minutes with some bleach and a rag. Chloe didn't speak to me for the rest of that evening. The grocery situation became a weekly nightmare. I had always done the shopping because I left work earlier than Chloe and the store was on my way home. Plus, I was better at meal planning and sticking to a budget. Now, I only bought food for myself, carefully calculating portions and leaving her to handle her own nutrition. The first week, she didn't realize what was happening until she went to make dinner and discovered we had ingredients for exactly one meal. She asked where everything else was, and I explained that I was practicing not making unilateral decisions about household needs, that buying food for both of us without consultation was presumptuous and controlling. Chloe ordered takeout that night, and I could practically see her mentally calculating how much this new arrangement was going to cost her. Our friends started noticing the change at a barbecue we hosted 3 weeks into my evolution. My buddy Daniel and his wife brought over their new patio fur. Rushing to solve her problems like she was incapable, that this was exactly the kind of protective behavior she'd identified as toxic. She hung up on me. I watched from the kitchen window as she stood in the rain, struggling to figure out the hood latch, then gave up and called an Uber that cost her $45. I jump-started her car that evening in about 3 minutes. The breaking point came on a Friday night. Chloe was coming home late from a client meeting downtown. She called me around 9 p.m., and her voice was shaking. She said there was a guy following her from the parking garage to her car and she was scared. My old instinct was to tell her to stay on the phone, to get to a populated area, to scream if he got too close, maybe even drive over there myself. Instead, I said, very calmly, that I trusted her judgment in handling the situation and that she was a strong, independent woman who didn't need a man to feel safe. I added that calling the police or building security would be more effective than relying on outdated damsel-in-distress dynamics. She made it sound like she'd been slapped, and the line went dead. She didn't answer when I called back. 20 minutes later, I heard her car pull into the driveway. She walked past me without speaking, went straight upstairs, and I heard the bedroom door lock. The next morning, she came downstairs. Her eyes were puffy, swollen, like she'd been crying all night. She said she couldn't do this anymore. That the house was falling apart. Everything was harder than it needed to be. And she felt completely alone, despite being married. I asked her what, specifically, she wanted me to change. And she struggled to articulate it, because doing so would mean admitting that all those traditional masculine behaviors she'd called toxic were actually things she needed. She finally said, "I want my husband back." And her voice cracked on the last word. I looked at her very carefully and asked, "Which one?" She went quiet. She understood what I meant. Did she want the husband who fixed things and carried heavy bags and made her coffee and protected her? Or did she want the evolved, progressive partner who treated her like a fully autonomous adult who didn't need any of that? She couldn't have both. And we both knew it. She whispered that she didn't know. And I told her to figure it out, because I was tired of being criticized for caring. The house fell into absolute chaos over the next 2 weeks. I watched it happen with the detachment of someone observing a controlled experiment. Dishes piled up in the sink because Chloe kept forgetting to run the dishwasher, and I no longer reminded her. The lawn grew tall enough that our neighbor left a passive-aggressive note about neighborhood standards. Duke tracked mud through the living room because nobody had fixed the loose board on the back porch that created a giant puddle when it rained. Our bedroom had boxes of Chloe's design supplies stacked against one wall because I'd always been the one to install shelving and organize storage solutions. The light bulb in the hallway burned out and stayed dark for 6 days. Every small thing I used to handle automatically became a glaring, visible absence, like removing the scaffolding from a building and watching it slowly, inevitably lean. Chloe stopped eating regular meals because coordinating groceries and cooking without any system overwhelmed her after long workdays. I'd find her at 10 p.m. eating cereal or crackers, looking utterly exhausted and defeated. She lost weight, and the shadows under her eyes grew darker. Her design work started suffering, too, because she was too stressed and tired to meet deadlines. I watched her panic over a client presentation she'd normally nail without breaking a sweat. On a Sunday morning, 2 weeks after our conversation, she came downstairs and found me reading on the couch. She sat down on the coffee table, directly in front of me, forcing me to look at her. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking. She told me she'd been wrong. Completely, stupidly wrong. And that the speech she'd made at my parents' house was the dumbest thing she'd ever done. She said she'd been spending too much time in online communities where women competed to see who could be the most progressive and critical of their partners, where every act of traditional masculinity got labeled as problematic, regardless of context or intent. She admitted that she'd felt pressure to perform wokeness. To prove she wasn't some suburban housewife who needed a man. And in trying to score points with strangers on the internet, she'd dismantled the actual good marriage she had with someone who genuinely loved her. Then she said, her voice cracking, "Your masculinity was never toxic, Michael. It was protective. And I'm sorry I couldn't see that until it was gone." The tears started then, and they weren't manipulative tears. They were the kind that come from a real, raw recognition of a profound mistake. I closed my book and just let her talk. She continued, saying she called her therapist and realized that most of what she'd been reading online was performative nonsense that didn't account for real relationships with real people who had different strengths and preferences. She said she didn't want a gender-neutral roommate. She wanted her husband back, the one who gave nature set that they wanted to assemble in our backyard. One of those complicated 8-piece deals with cushions and a table. Daniel, naturally, asked if I could help him carry the boxes from his truck. I politely declined, saying I was working on not perpetuating stereotypes about men always handling physical labor. Everyone kind of laughed awkwardly, thinking I was joking, until they realized I was completely serious. Daniel and his wife ended up struggling with the boxes themselves while I sat on our deck, casually drinking a beer. Chloe's face turned scarlet, but she couldn't say anything without completely contradicting her own speech about toxic masculinity. Later that evening, after everyone left, she said I was being deliberately unhelpful. I asked her, very calmly, what part of respecting equality and rejecting traditional gender roles do you want me to stop doing? She didn't have an answer. The car situation is what finally scared her. It was a rainy morning in late June, and Chloe's Honda wouldn't start, just made that familiar clicking sound that usually means a dead battery. She called me from the driveway, clearly expecting me to come out and either jump it or figure out the problem. I was in the middle of my morning coffee. I told her that car trouble was stressful, but I had confidence she could handle it, that calling AAA or watching a YouTube video on jumpstarting would be a great growth opportunity. Her voice got sharp. She said she was going to be late for a client meeting. I reminded her that I was working on not a damn about her well-being, even if it meant doing things she could technically do herself. She acknowledged that there was a fundamental difference between controlling behavior and caring behavior, between infantilizing someone and simply loving them enough to make their life easier. I sat there for a long moment, because this was the absolute crossroads. What I said next would determine whether we had a marriage worth saving. I told her, very clearly, that I would never again be publicly humiliated for being the kind of man my father taught me to be. I said if she wanted me back, then she needed to understand that I was going to fix things and carry heavy bags and make her coffee and handle the finances and protect her. Not because I thought she was incapable, but because that's how I showed love, and I wasn't going to apologize for it anymore. I told her she could either accept that this was who I was and appreciate it, or I would help her pack and we could go our separate ways. But I was done walking on eggshells in my own marriage. Chloe nodded. She said she understood. And then she asked what she could do to fix this. I told her there was one thing. 3 days later, we were back at my parents' house for dinner. I could see the tension in my dad, Arthur's shoulders when we walked in, like he was bracing for another awkward speech. My mom, Eleanor, hugged us both, but her smile was cautious. We sat down to eat, and about halfway through the meal, Chloe stood up. She tapped her glass, exactly like she'd done before. The entire table went silent, and I saw my dad's jaw clench. Chloe's hands were shaking, but her voice was clear when she spoke. She said, "A few weeks ago, I stood here and said some things about Michael that I need to publicly correct." She explained that she'd accused him of toxic masculinity when the truth was that everything he did came from a place of love and partnership. She said she'd been influenced by social media narratives that painted traditional male behavior as inherently problematic, without acknowledging context or intention. She told my parents that their son was the best man she knew. That he'd spent our entire marriage making her life better in countless ways she'd taken for granted, and that she was grateful every single day that he'd chosen to be patient with her while she figured out what actually mattered. She said, "Michael isn't toxic. He's exactly the kind of husband any woman should hope for." And I'm sorry I didn't say that the first time. My mom started crying immediately. And my dad's whole face softened in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. He reached across the table and squeezed my shoulder without saying anything, because he didn't need to. After dinner, I fixed the garbage disposal that had been rattling, carried in Duke's food without being asked, and made Chloe her cappuccino the next morning. She watched me do these things with a different expression than before. Not entitlement, but genuine, heartfelt appreciation. 2 weeks later, Chloe asked if she could post something on her Instagram and showed me the draft before publishing. It was a photo of us from our wedding, and a long caption about how she'd almost destroyed her marriage by confusing strength with toxicity and partnership with oppression. She wrote about learning the difference between a man who controls you and a man who protects you, between someone who infantilizes you and someone who simply loves you enough to make your life easier. The post got hundreds of comments, mostly from women sharing similar realizations about their own relationships. Some criticized her for being anti-feminist, but plenty more thanked her for saying what they'd been afraid to admit. Things aren't perfect now, because marriage never is, but they're real. Chloe thanks me when I fix things, and I thank her when she does the emotional labor I'm not naturally good at. We're building something honest now, instead of performing for an invisible audience of people who don't actually care about our happiness. I learned something important through all of this. Something I wish I'd understood earlier. The strongest thing you can sometimes do in a relationship isn't to fight or argue or explain. It's to step back and let someone experience the full weight of what they're asking for. Chloe didn't need a lecture about why she was wrong. She needed to live in the absence of everything she'd taken for granted. Sometimes the only way to make someone appreciate what they have is to let them lose it, even temporarily, even when it hurts you both. My masculinity was never the problem, and her need for independence was never really about independence. The problem was gratitude, or the lack of it. And sometimes you have to take everything off the table before someone realizes what was actually there all along. I'm still trying to figure out how much I actually lost during those weeks. What do you think? Was this extreme, or was it the only way to make Chloe see the truth? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever had a similar experience, share your story. I'm reading every single one.